Welcome, viewers. Today we're diving into the complex and controversial Ukraine conflict from a conservative perspective. This ongoing crisis represents a tangled web of geopolitical ambitions, historical grievances, and ideological divides. From NATO's eastward expansion to Russia's 2022 invasion, we'll examine how key decisions by various administrations contributed to the current situation. We'll analyze how conservative thinkers view this conflict, often through skepticism of Western interventionism and concerns about unintended consequences of U.S. foreign policy. Join me as we explore the historical context, key events, and potential paths forward in this critical international crisis. Before we dive into specific events, let's establish our framework for understanding this conflict. First, we're dealing with an incredibly complex geopolitical situation involving multiple nations with competing interests. Russia, Ukraine, the United States, and European powers all have stakes in this crisis. Second, historical grievances dating back decades and in some cases centuries fuel the present tensions. The shared history between Russia and Ukraine creates layers of complexity that simple narratives often miss. Finally, through a conservative lens, we see consistent critiques of NATO expansion as a key factor in escalating tensions. This perspective emphasizes caution about American involvement in distant conflicts where our direct interests might not be clearly defined. To understand today's conflict, we must acknowledge the deep ties between Ukraine and Russia. These nations share cultural and historical bonds dating back over 1,000 years, with Kiev once serving as the center of the first East Slavic state. Russian leaders, including Putin, often reference this shared heritage when discussing their claims to Ukrainian territory. Strategically, Ukraine's location has always been crucial to Russia's security interests, providing a buffer zone between Russia and Western powers. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, these post-Soviet tensions emerged as Ukraine and Russia took increasingly divergent paths. While Russia maintained authoritarian tendencies, Ukraine experienced more democratic movements, creating ideological friction that would eventually erupt into open conflict. The first major breaking point came with Ukraine's Orange Revolution in 2004-2005. After a fraud-tainted election victory by Viktor Yanukovych, thousands of Ukrainians took to the streets in pro-Western protests, demonstrating for closer ties with the West and democratic reforms. These protests ultimately led to Viktor Yushchenko becoming president, a leader who actively pursued EU integration and even NATO membership. From Moscow's perspective, these events were deeply concerning. The Kremlin viewed the Orange Revolution not as a genuine democratic movement, but as Western interference in its sphere of influence. This perspective would shape Russia's increasingly aggressive stance toward Ukraine in subsequent years as they grew determined to prevent Ukraine from slipping completely into the Western orbit. NATO's post-Cold War expansion eastward represents a crucial factor in the conflict from a conservative viewpoint. Following the Soviet collapse, NATO grew from 16 members to 30, incorporating many former Warsaw Pact countries and even former Soviet republics like the Baltic states. For Russia, this expansion created a sense of encirclement, with a military alliance they view as hostile, moving ever closer to their borders. Many conservative critics in the West questioned this expansion, arguing it unnecessarily provoked Russia without enhancing American security. Prominent voices like George Kennan, the architect of Cold War containment policy, warned that NATO expansion would inflame Russian nationalism and militarism, predictions that now seem prophetic in light of current events. The 2008 NATO Bucharest summit marked a critical inflection point in East-West relations. At this summit, NATO declared an open-door policy specifically for Ukraine and Georgia, stating that these countries will become members of NATO without specifying when or how this would occur. Russia voiced immediate and strong opposition to this declaration, with Putin personally attending the summit to express his concerns. In retrospect, many conservative analysts view this summit as planting the seeds of future conflict. By offering the prospect of membership without actually extending the security guarantees that come with it, NATO placed Ukraine in a vulnerable position. antagonizing Russia without providing protection. This ambiguous status would prove dangerous for Ukraine in the years ahead. By 2010, Viktor Yanukovych had made a political comeback, winning the Ukrainian presidency and bringing a pro-Russian stance to government policy. His administration favored closer ties with Russia over Western integration, responding to economic pressures from both sides. Russia offered Ukraine cheaper gas prices and loans, while the EU pushed for political reforms and economic integration. The pivotal moment came in November 2013 when Yanukovych rejected the EU association agreement at the last minute after intense pressure from Moscow. This decision, appearing to choose Russia over European integration, ignited the spark that would soon engulf the country in crisis. Conservative analysts note that both Russia and the West were engaged in a tug-of-war over Ukraine, with little regard for the consequences to Ukrainians themselves. Yanukovych's rejection of the EU deal triggered massive pro-EU demonstrations in Kyiv's Maidan Square, which quickly grew into a broader anti-government movement. These protests eventually turned violent when the government cracked down on demonstrators, leading to dozens of deaths. The situation escalated rapidly, with protesters occupying government buildings and demanding Yanukovych's resignation. By February 2014, Yanukovych had fled to Russia, effectively being ousted from power. From a conservative perspective, while the protesters had legitimate grievances, there are questions about Western involvement in supporting this movement. Some conservative commentators have characterized these events as a Western-backed coup that overthrew a democratically elected leader, regardless of his flaws. Russia responded to Yanukovych's ousting with a swift military operation in Crimea. Using unmarked troops, the so-called Little Green Men, Russia effectively took control of the peninsula within days. A hastily organized referendum was held, which purportedly showed overwhelming support for joining Russia, leading to formal annexation. The international community widely condemned this move as illegal under international law. However, Russia justified its actions as protecting ethnic Russians and Russian speakers following what it viewed as an illegal coup in Kyiv. The annexation occurred with minimal resistance, partly due to Crimea's historical ties to Russia and its majority Russian-speaking population. This marked the first forcible change of European borders since World War II, setting a dangerous precedent. Following the Crimea annexation, pro-Russian separatist movements emerged in eastern Ukraine's Donbas region, particularly in Donetsk and Luhansk. These movements, which many believe received direct support from Russia, declared independent people's republics. Ukraine responded with what it termed an anti-terrorist operation to regain control. The conflict quickly escalated into a full-scale war, with Russia providing equipment, volunteers, and eventually regular troops, though Moscow consistently denied direct involvement. The Minsk agreements of 2014 and 2015 attempted to create a ceasefire and political resolution, but they ultimately failed to resolve the conflict. By conservative estimates, this war had claimed over 14,000 lives before the 2022 full-scale invasion, creating a frozen conflict that would simmer for 8 years. The Obama administration responded to the 2014 crisis with a two-pronged approach. First, they imposed economic sanctions on Russian individuals and entities, though they stopped short of the most severe measures. Second, they provided non-lethal aid to Ukraine, including training, equipment, and financial assistance. From a conservative viewpoint, this response was criticized as insufficient, strong enough to antagonize Russia, but too weak to meaningfully protect Ukraine or deter further aggression. The administration's reluctance to provide lethal weapons was particularly controversial. While Obama officials worried that arming Ukraine might escalate the conflict, critics argued this hesitation simply encouraged Russian aggression by demonstrating American unwillingness to meaningfully intervene. The Trump administration's approach to Ukraine presented a mix of policies. On one hand, the administration maintained and even expanded sanctions against Russia that had been implemented under Obama. More significantly, Trump approved lethal aid to Ukraine in 2017, including Javelin anti-tank missiles that Obama had withheld. However, the administration's Ukraine policy became embroiled in controversy during the famous phone call between President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky, which led to Trump's first impeachment. Conservative commentators typically view this impeachment as politically motivated, arguing it distracted from legitimate concerns about corruption in Ukraine. Throughout this period, Trump expressed skepticism about extensive U.S. involvement in Ukraine, while simultaneously taking concrete steps to help strengthen Ukraine's military position. When President Biden took office in 2021, his administration emphasized strong support for Ukraine and took a more confrontational stance toward Russia than his predecessor. The administration warned repeatedly about intelligence showing Russian preparations for a potential invasion, though these warnings were initially met with skepticism both in Ukraine and Europe. At the same time, there were concerns about whether these strong rhetorical positions might actually be provoking Russia rather than deterring aggression. From a conservative perspective, the Biden administration's emphasis on democratic values and Western unity, while admirable in principle, may have lacked the pragmatic recognition of power realities that conservative foreign policy typically prioritizes. Critics argue that stronger deterrence measures earlier might have prevented the eventual invasion. Throughout 2021 and early 2022, Russia amassed an unprecedented military force along Ukraine's borders. Satellite imagery showed massive troop movements, with estimates eventually reaching over 150,000 soldiers positioned for potential invasion. Western intelligence agencies issued increasingly urgent warnings about Russian intentions, though many analysts still believed Putin was bluffing to extract concessions. Russia claimed these movements were merely exercises, while simultaneously issuing demands that NATO formally renounce any future Ukrainian membership and withdraw forces from Eastern Europe. These demands were rejected by the West as non-starters. Conservative analysts note that this buildup occurred after years of mixed Western signals about Ukraine's status, creating a dangerous ambiguity that Putin ultimately chose to resolve through force. On February 24, 2022, Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, attacking from multiple fronts simultaneously, from Belarus in the north, Russia in the east, and Crimea in the south. The invasion shocked much of the world despite the warnings, as many believed Putin would limit operations to the eastern regions. The international response was swift, with unprecedented sanctions targeting Russian banks, businesses, and individuals. From a conservative perspective, while Putin's aggression was unjustified and morally wrong, the invasion also represented a failure of Western deterrence. The question remained whether earlier, clearer boundaries might have prevented this escalation, as ambiguous security arrangements left Ukraine vulnerable while simultaneously threatening Russian security interests. The Western response to Russia's invasion was more unified and severe than many had anticipated. Economic sanctions reached unprecedented levels, targeting everything from Russia's central bank to individual oligarchs. Military aid began flowing to Ukraine in quantities that would have been unimaginable before the invasion. Perhaps most surprisingly, NATO displayed remarkable unity, with even traditionally cautious members like Germany dramatically increasing defense spending and providing weapons. Conservative commentators have both praised and criticized this response, acknowledging the moral necessity of supporting Ukraine while questioning the long-term sustainability of open-ended commitments and raising concerns about escalation risks. The economic impacts on Western countries themselves, particularly through energy prices, have also been a source of conservative criticism. Conservative views on the Ukraine conflict don't fit neatly into a single position. There's significant criticism of U.S. involvement, with some voices questioning whether American interests are truly at stake. Many conservatives express concerns about provoking Russia, especially given its nuclear arsenal, and worry about mission creep as aid commitments grow ever larger. A consistent theme in conservative commentary is emphasizing European responsibility for European security, arguing that wealthy European nations should bear more of the burden for supporting Ukraine. Others stress that while supporting Ukraine is morally right, America's strategic focus should remain on the greater threat posed by China. These diverse perspectives reflect the complexity of applying conservative principles to an unprovoked invasion of a sovereign nation. Energy politics has played a central role in this conflict. Russia has historically used its gas supplies as leverage over Europe, particularly Germany, which became heavily dependent on Russian natural gas. The controversial Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which would have increased this dependency, became a major point of contention between the U.S. and Germany prior to the invasion. Following the invasion, the pipeline project was suspended. The United States has pushed for diversification of European energy supplies, including through American LNG exports. From a conservative viewpoint, this situation validates long-standing concerns about European energy dependency on Russia. Many conservative voices have called for increased domestic energy production in both the U.S. and Europe as a national security imperative to reduce leverage that hostile powers can exert through energy markets. This conflict has featured an unprecedented information war alongside the physical fighting. Russia has actively spread disinformation about alleged Ukrainian atrocities and Nazi elements within Ukraine's government to justify its invasion. Ukraine has countered with its own powerful narrative, effectively using social media to rally international support and document Russian actions. Western media coverage has been criticized by some conservative commentators for alleged bias, sometimes overlooking the complex historical context or ignoring legitimate security concerns that motivated Russian actions, however unjustified the invasion itself may be. This information warfare demonstrates how modern conflicts are fought not just on the battlefield, but in the realm of public opinion, where perception can be as important as reality. One of the conflict's most far-reaching consequences has been its impact on global food security. Ukraine and Russia together account for nearly a third of the world's wheat exports and significant portions of other grains and cooking oils. The war disrupted Ukrainian grain exports, with Russian blockades preventing shipments from leaving Black Sea ports until a UN-brokered deal partially restored flows. These disruptions led to severe shortages and price spikes, particularly affecting vulnerable populations in the Middle East and Africa. Conservative policy voices have emphasized how this crisis highlights the dangers of global food supply chain vulnerabilities and called for increased domestic agricultural production as a matter of national security. This aspect of the conflict demonstrates how regional wars can have truly global humanitarian consequences. China has emerged as a key player in this conflict, though it has tried to maintain strategic ambiguity. China and Russia declared a no-limits strategic partnership shortly before the invasion. Yet China has been careful not to provide direct military aid that would trigger Western sanctions. Economically, China has provided Russia a lifeline by increasing energy purchases and providing alternative payment systems that bypass Western sanctions. Conservative analysts warn about the emergence of a Sino-Russian axis that could challenge the Western-led international order, potentially dividing the world into competing blocs. This alignment represents a significant strategic challenge for the United States, potentially forcing America to confront two major adversaries simultaneously, precisely the scenario that conservative strategic thinkers have long warned against. Perhaps the most alarming dimension of this conflict has been the nuclear saber-rattling. Russia has repeatedly threatened the potential use of nuclear weapons if it perceives existential threats, raising fears of escalation to a level not seen since the Cold War. Additionally, fighting around Ukrainian nuclear facilities, particularly the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, has created fears of a potential nuclear accident. From a conservative national security perspective, this situation highlights the continuing importance of strategic deterrence and the dangers of conventional conflicts between nuclear powers. It validates long-standing conservative concerns about nuclear proliferation and emphasizes why great power competition must be managed carefully to prevent catastrophic escalation. These nuclear dimensions have forced difficult calculations about how far Western support for Ukraine can go without triggering even greater dangers. The Ukraine conflict has dramatically transformed NATO, an alliance that French President Macron once described as experiencing brain death has found renewed purpose and unity. Finland and Sweden abandoned decades of neutrality to join the alliance, bringing significant military capabilities and strategically important territory. Debates about NATO's fundamental purpose have been reinvigorated, with conservatives divided between those who see the alliance as essential to American security and those who question whether expanded commitments truly serve U.S. interests. This evolution raises profound questions about NATO's future role. Will it remain primarily focused on territorial defense, or will it expand its mission to address broader challenges? The answers will shape European security architecture for decades to come. American military assistance to Ukraine has evolved dramatically since the invasion began. Initially focused on anti-tank and air defense systems, U.S. aid has gradually included more advanced systems, including HIMARS rocket systems, Patriot air defenses, and eventually approval for F-16 fighter jets. This aid has been accompanied by extensive training of Ukrainian forces, both inside Ukraine and at facilities throughout Europe. From a conservative perspective, concerns about mission creep have grown as these commitments have expanded. Questions remain about whether there are clear strategic objectives guiding these decisions, or if the policy is driven by incremental responses without a defined endgame. The massive scale of this assistance, over $100 billion across all categories, has raised questions about fiscal responsibility and long-term sustainability, core conservative concerns. The economic consequences of this conflict for Western nations have been substantial. Inflation, already rising due to pandemic-related factors, was exacerbated by energy and food price spikes following the invasion. The sanctions regime, while necessary from a strategic perspective, has created economic strain on Western economies as well as Russia's. Government budgets have been stretched by military aid commitments and the costs of supporting Ukrainian refugees. Conservative critiques have focused on these economic impacts, questioning whether the burden is being shared equitably among allies and whether economic pain at home is being adequately considered in policy decisions. These critiques reflect the traditional conservative emphasis on fiscal responsibility and prioritizing domestic economic well-being. Despite numerous attempts, diplomatic efforts to end the conflict have repeatedly failed. Multiple ceasefire attempts have collapsed almost immediately, with both sides accusing the other of violations. Turkey, along with other nations like Israel and China, has attempted to play mediating roles with limited success. From a conservative realpolitik perspective, any sustainable peace will likely require difficult compromises that acknowledge the military realities on the ground, however unfortunate those may be. Some conservative voices have called for a greater emphasis on diplomacy, arguing that the West should be facilitating negotiations rather than focusing exclusively on military support. Others counter that negotiation is impossible until Russia faces sufficient military setbacks to accept a just peace rather than merely a pause before renewed aggression. Ukraine faces enormous challenges regardless of how the conflict eventually ends. Reconstruction will require hundreds of billions of dollars and many years. The country continues to pursue EU membership, which would provide economic benefits but require significant domestic reforms. Its relationship with NATO remains uncertain. Formal membership might prevent future Russian aggression, but could also be seen as a provocation that would make peace impossible. From a conservative standpoint, Ukraine's future must balance legitimate security needs with realistic assessments of geopolitical realities. While supporting Ukrainian sovereignty and independence is morally right, questions remain about what security arrangements are sustainable in a region where Russian power and interests cannot simply be wished away, regardless of the moral judgment on Russia's actions. Russia will emerge from this conflict substantially weakened regardless of the military outcome. The economic isolation resulting from Western sanctions has set Russian development back by years, if not decades. Military losses have been severe, with estimates of casualties reaching into the tens of thousands. Russia's influence has been contained, with countries formerly in its orbit now seeking Western protection. From a conservative strategic perspective, while weakening Russia serves some Western interests, an unstable nuclear-armed Russia creates its own dangers. The likelihood of increased Russian dependence on China also raises concerns about strengthening an even more significant strategic rival. These complex trade-offs demonstrate why conservative foreign policy typically emphasizes caution and stability rather than idealistic transformative goals. This conflict offers several crucial lessons for American foreign policy from a conservative perspective. First, there's the challenge of balancing support for allies and partners with clear-eyed assessment of core U.S. interests. Second, the war underscores the importance of European defense capabilities. Allies must develop the means to address regional security challenges without complete dependence on American power. Finally, it highlights the need for strategic prioritization in an era of growing challenges from multiple directions, particularly from China. Conservative principles of prudence, restraint, and maintaining a balance of power remain relevant guides for navigating these complex geopolitical waters. Perhaps the most important lesson is the danger of strategic ambiguity, unclear commitments and security guarantees that can lead to miscalculation and conflict. As this conflict continues with no clear resolution in sight, the path forward remains uncertain. Finding the right balance between supporting Ukraine and avoiding dangerous escalation will require careful statecraft. The conservative approach to this crisis emphasizes realistic assessment of power dynamics, recognition of the limits of American influence, and prudent weighing of risks and benefits, while supporting Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity aligns with both American values and interests. How this support is calibrated matters enormously. As we navigate these geopolitical challenges, conservative principles remind us to prioritize American security, maintain military strength, seek diplomatic solutions where possible, and approach foreign entanglements with caution. The world that emerges from this conflict will be shaped by the decisions made today. Thank you for watching this analysis of the Ukraine conflict through a conservative lens. If you found this perspective valuable, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth analysis of crucial international issues. By understanding different viewpoints on complex global challenges, we can all become better informed citizens. Share your thoughts in the comments below and join us next time as we continue to explore the most important geopolitical developments shaping our world.